September 12, 1944. Imperial War College, Tokyo. Colonel Hattori Takushiro, chief of the operations section, spread reconnaissance photographs across the mahogany conference table. His staff had analyzed the Wehrmacht's collapse across France with meticulous precision. "The Americans have repeated Germany's fatal error," he announced to the assembled generals. "They have built an army that outruns its own stomach. Patton advances 60 kilometers daily. This is not warfare, this is suicide. No mechanized force can sustain such speed without fuel, ammunition, and parts flowing faster than bullets." From his position overlooking the Imperial Gardens, Hattori calculated what every Japanese officer understood from studying the German debacle. A single American armored division consumed 570,000 liters of fuel per day when advancing. The supply lines from Normandy now stretched over 650 kilometers. The mathematics were inescapable. Within days, perhaps hours, Patton's Third Army would sputter to a halt on empty roads, giving Germany time to fortify the Rhine, perhaps hold until winter's arrival. What Hattori didn't know was that 9,000 kilometers away, 5 of 958 American trucks were already thundering across France in an endless river of steel, headlights blazing in defiance of every military textbook ever written, carrying 12,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours. The Red Ball Express, a logistics operation so audacious that Japanese military science had dismissed it as American propaganda, was about to shatter every assumption about mechanized warfare that Tokyo and Berlin shared. Within 72 hours, Patton's supposedly paralyzed tanks would smash through German positions at the Moselle. Within a week, they would be threatening the industrial heart of the Saar. Within a month, they would stand at the Siegfried Line, ready to pierce Germany itself. The Imperial General Staff's finest strategic minds were about to receive a lesson in American logistics that would redefine their understanding of modern war, delivered by 23,000 truck drivers, 75% of them African American, who transformed a one-way highway into the most efficient military supply artery in history. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. The Japanese High Command's certainty in Western logistical collapse stemmed from decades of military doctrine and painful recent experience. Japan had pioneered rapid mechanized advances in China, understood intimately the tyranny of supply lines, and watched with satisfaction as Germany's armies foundered when logistics failed to keep pace with tactical brilliance. In China, Japan's own advances had repeatedly stalled, not from Chinese resistance, but from the brutal reality of supplying forces across continental distances. Trucks broke down on mountain roads. Railway networks couldn't reach advancing spearheads. Supply depots emptied faster than convoys could replenish them. Lieutenant General Kawabe Torashiro, Deputy Chief of the Army General Staff, had written in August 1944, "The Americans face the identical logistical impossibility we mastered in China and Germany failed to solve in Russia. Their mechanical superiority becomes their fatal weakness. Machines devour fuel, ammunition, spare parts. They have advanced 650 kilometers in 6 weeks. History teaches us what comes next. Paralysis." Japanese intelligence meticulously tracked American consumption rates. A single Sherman tank burned barely 2 kilometers per liter on roads, worse across country. An infantry division required 700 tons of supplies daily. An armored division needed 1,000 tons. Patton commanded 12 divisions advancing on a 100-kilometer front. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. 12,000 tons daily, transported 650 kilometers From the beaches over damaged roads, through a transportation network the Germans had systematically destroyed during their retreat. Major General Arisue Seizo, Chief of Intelligence, calculated in his September briefing, even if the Americans possessed unlimited trucks, which they don't, and perfect roads, which they don't, and no mechanical failures, which violates physical law, they still cannot sustain Patton's advance more than 48 hours. Industrial capacity cannot overcome geography. The laws of logistics cannot be violated, not even by American factories. At 1400 hours on August 25, 1944, in a requisitioned French chateau near Laval, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Gravitt of the Motor Transport Service faced a room full of exhausted officers. The projections they presented defied belief. Patton's Third Army was consuming supplies faster than any army in human history, advancing at speeds that broke every logistics manual. Traditional supply methods, railway transport, scheduled convoys, depot-to-depot distribution, had collapsed under the strain. "Gentlemen," Gravitt announced, "we're establishing a one-way highway system from the beaches to the front lines. Every vehicle operates 20 hours out of 24. No stopping except for fuel and emergencies. We move 12,500 tons daily. Minimum." The name came from railway terminology. A red ball freight was an express shipment that took absolute priority over everything else. The Red Ball Express would operate on the same principle. Absolute priority, no delays, no exceptions. The operational specifications defied Japanese military doctrine as completely as German. 2 parallel one-way highways, one for loaded trucks advancing, one for empties returning. 24-hour operations with headlights blazing, abandoning blackout discipline. No stop policy except for fuel and mechanical breakdowns. 5-minute convoy intervals, maintaining 56 kph average speed. Mobile maintenance units every 80 kilometers. Military police checkpoints removing any vehicle below 40 kph. Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, commanding the advanced section of the communications zone, reviewed the numbers. "We need 140 truck companies, 5,958 vehicles minimum, operating at 90% availability. Gentlemen, this violates every logistics principle we teach at Staff College." Yet within 36 hours, the impossible was operational. On August 26, 1944, drivers from the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC CC Kelbau 2.5-ton trucks, nicknamed Deuce and a Half, loaded with 105mm artillery shells bound for Patton'S guns, 480 kilometers east. The demographic composition of the Red Ball Express would have stunned Japanese racial theorists as completely as it stunned Germans. Of the 23,000 drivers who would eventually operate the route, approximately 75% were African-American soldiers serving in a still segregated army. These men, barred from combat roles and denied basic equality in their own country, were keeping America's most celebrated general's army in motion. The drivers developed their own culture within hours. They painted slogans on truck sides: "Patton's Blood Bank," "Hitler, Here We Come," "Detroit to Berlin Express." They created their own traffic rules. Slower vehicles pulled off immediately. Mechanical failures were pushed into ditches. Any truck below 32 kph was considered a roadblock. By August 28th, German reconnaissance units began reporting something unprecedented. Units from the 116th Panzer Division radioed from positions overlooking the main Red Ball route. Continuous vehicle column, headlights visible for 32 kilometers. No spacing, no blackout discipline. Estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour. Americans have abandoned all tactical caution. In Tokyo, when these reports arrived via diplomatic channels from Berlin, The reaction was different than Germany's tactical confusion. It was something closer to recognition and dread. The teletype machine in the Imperial War College's intelligence annex began chattering at 03:17 hours on September 15, 1944. Lieutenant Nakamura Kenji, the night duty officer, watched the paper ribbon emerge with growing unease. From Military Attaché Berlin. Priority? Immediate. Subject: Allied Advance Western Front Patton. 3rd Army crossed Moselle River, 600 hours. 14 September. Advance continues unabated. Fuel supplies maintained. Repeat. Supplies maintained. Convoy operations exceed all projections. Wehrmacht intelligence confirms continuous truck movement Normandy to front. Estimate 6,000 plus vehicles operational. Nakamura read it twice, then reached for the telephone. By 06:20 hours, Colonel Hattori stood before the same mahogany table where 3 days earlier he had predicted American collapse. The assembled officers stared at the decoded message in silence. "Impossible," Major General Arisui finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The mathematics." "The mathematics were correct," Hattori interrupted, his jaw tight. "The assumptions were not." Captain Tsuji Masanobu, known for his sharp tongue, leaned forward. 6,000 trucks operating continuously? The Germans must be— The Germans are not wrong." Hattori dropped another cable on the table. "This arrived 20 minutes ago from our attaché in Vichy. French resistance reports the same. The Americans move like rivers of metal. His words, not mine." A younger officer, fresh from Staff College, spoke up. "Sir, even if the numbers are accurate, surely they cannot sustain—" "Lieutenant, be silent." Hattori's voice cut through the room like a blade. "What we believed cannot be sustained is happening. What we calculated as impossible is operational. The question now is not whether it is happening, but how and what it means." Across the annex, a clerk was already pinning new reports to the intelligence map. Red markers traced Patton's advance like arterial blood flowing across France's geography. 650 kilometers away, France. Night. The sound reached you before the sight. A mechanical thunder that never ceased, rolling across the darkness like an approaching storm that refused to break. Then the lights. Headlights blazing in pairs, stretching back beyond the horizon, each set following the one ahead with mathematical precision. The Red Ball Express was a river of illuminated steel, flowing east through the French countryside at 56 kilometers per hour, relentless as gravity. Private James Walker, driving truck number 347 of the 3916th Quartermaster Company, had been on the road for 18 hours. His hands gripped the wheel with the muscle memory of repetition, his eyes fixed on the taillights ahead. Behind him, 5 tons of artillery shells. Around him, thousands of men doing exactly the same thing. No stops, no rest, no slowing down. The white MP at the last checkpoint had waved him through without looking up. "Keep moving, soldier. Patton's waiting." Walker had wanted to laugh. Patton wasn't waiting. Nobody was waiting. That was the whole point. The Americans had built something the textbooks said couldn't exist. A supply line that moved faster than the army it fed. Overhead, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the human machinery below. But that machinery was rewriting the rules of war with every kilometer traveled, every ton delivered, every hour that defied calculation. In Tokyo, the generals were beginning to understand. In France, the trucks never stopped rolling. The Red Ball Express had no singular beginning. It erupted into existence like a force of nature, sprawling across 650 kilometers of French roadway with the organizational chaos of a revolution and the precision of a factory floor. At the Chartres Dispatch Hub, Captain William Robinson of the 514th Quartermaster Battalion stood on a wooden platform, watching the controlled pandemonium below. Every 5 minutes, another convoy of 40 trucks roared out toward the front. Every 5 minutes, another 40 empties returned, drivers hollow-eyed but moving. "How many today, sir?" his clerk asked. Robinson checked his clipboard. 1,700 sorties, 12,000 tons delivered. We're 3 hours ahead of schedule. The clerk shook his head. "The manual says this can't work." "Then burn the manual, Lieutenant." "Because it's working." Below them, the mechanics worked in shifts that never ended. Sergeant Antonio Morales, a Chicano mechanic from Los Angeles, had his hands buried in an engine block that had thrown a rod at kilometer 180. His crew, a Polish immigrant from Detroit, a Cherokee from Oklahoma, and a white farm boy from Iowa, moved around the truck like a surgical team, swapping parts without speaking, their coordination earned through 18-hour days where silence was faster than words. "Crankshafts shot," Morales muttered. 20 minutes. The driver, Corporal Robert Hayes from Alabama, leaned against the truck bed, smoking. Hayes was black. So were 3/4 of the men around him. The Army had put them in supply because they wouldn't let them fight. Now they were fighting a different kind of war, one measured in kilometers traveled and tons delivered rather than enemy killed. "You ever sleep, Morales?" Hayes asked. "I'll sleep when Hitler does." Morales wiped grease on his coveralls. "Permanently." 2 trucks over, Lieutenant David Cohen, a Jewish officer from Brooklyn, was arguing with a convoy commander about route selection. Behind them, Private Joseph Joe Yazzie, a Navajo code talker temporarily assigned to logistics, was helping translate coordinates from a French resistance fighter whose English was worse than Yazzie's French. This was the Red Ball Express. Every color, every background, every grudge and prejudice that America carried, all unified by a single purpose: keep the trucks moving. The engine roar was constant, omnipresent, the mechanical heartbeat of Allied advance. It drowned out conversation, forced men to read lips and gestures. It made sleep impossible for those trying to rest in nearby tents. It became the sound of 1944, more constant than artillery, more relentless than rain. At the fuel depot in Le Mans, Sergeant Ruth Wilson of the Women's Army Corps oversaw the pumping of 50,000 gallons into waiting trucks. The men called her Mother Gasoline. She kept the flow moving with the precision of a conductor, her hand signals directing drivers to open pumps, her voice, when she bothered to use it, cutting through the engine noise like a saw. "Next, pump 3! Move it, soldier! Patton's not getting younger." The trucks rolled forward, always forward. Somewhere in Tokyo, generals studied maps and tried to understand the impossible. Here, on the French roads, impossibility had become routine. The engines roared, the wheels turned, the highway never slept, and neither did the men who built it. The debate began quietly, as dangerous conversations always did in Tokyo's halls of power. It was September 18, 1944. The intelligence reports from France now arrived daily, each one documenting American logistical capacity that exceeded the previous day's impossibility. In a smaller conference room, away from the grand mahogany tables and formal protocols, a group of mid-level officers gathered for what would later be called the heretical meeting. Colonel Hattori presided, but he did not dominate. For once, the rigid hierarchy loosened enough for truth to breathe. "The question," Major Fujiwara stated carefully, "is whether we could replicate such an operation, theoretically." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Captain Tsuji, never one for diplomatic evasion, spoke first. "We possess neither the vehicles nor the roads. Our truck production is 1/20th of America's. Our roads cannot sustain such weight. The answer is no. We could not." "That's not the question," interrupted Commander Nakamura Ryunosuke, a naval logistics officer who had been invited specifically for his operational expertise. The question is whether we ever conceived it as possible, whether our doctrine allows for such thinking. He stood, walking to the map of the Pacific theater that dominated one wall. In the Philippines, our 14th Army required 700 tons of supplies daily. We calculated every barge, every transport ship, every ton of rice, down to the kernel. We achieved 60% efficiency and called it a triumph. His finger traced shipping routes that looked painfully sparse compared to the Red Ball Express diagrams from France. The Americans moved 12,500 tons daily overland continuously and consider it merely adequate. They have the industrial capacity, another officer objected. We do not. This is not a failure of thinking, but of resources. Is it? Nakamura turned back to face them. His next words would be quoted in post-war memoirs as the moment the imperial facade cracked. Without oil and tires, gentlemen, courage is only poetry. We have built an empire on the poetry of sacrifice and the spirituality of endurance. The Americans built theirs on rubber, petroleum, and assembly lines. The room remained silent. No one challenged him. No one agreed with him openly. The truth sat among them like an unwelcome guest that couldn't be expelled. Major General Kawabe, the senior officer present after Hattori, finally spoke. Our soldiers can march 60 kilometers a day, carrying full equipment. American soldiers require trucks. We call this superiority of spirit. And when our soldiers arrive after their 60-kilometer march, Nakamura said quietly, they have no ammunition because we lack the trucks to deliver it. The Americans arrive fresh, with full magazines, supported by artillery that never runs out of shells. Tell me, General, who wins that battle? Another officer, younger, more indoctrinated, stood abruptly. This is defeatist talk. The Americans may have machines, but we have Yamato Damashi. Hattori finished for him, the Japanese spirit. Yes, Lieutenant, we have heard the phrase. We have built our strategy around it. And now we must ask ourselves, honestly, in this room, where our words will not be reported, whether spirit can defeat 6,000 trucks running 20 hours daily. No one answered. Outside, Tokyo continued its rhythms. Factory workers, soldiers drilling, children in schools learning about Japan's divine destiny. Inside this room, a different education was beginning. The education of doubt, the recognition that will, however pure, cannot outrun logistics. That faith, however strong, cannot substitute for fuel. The meeting adjourned without conclusions, but every man left carrying the same forbidden question. What if we've been wrong about everything? Private James Walker's hands had stopped shaking somewhere around the 200-kilometer mark. Now, at hour 22 of his shift, they simply gripped the wheel with the numb persistence of meat and bone that had forgotten how to quit. Rain hammered the windshield. The wipers, one broken, one working, smeared mud across his field of vision in rhythmic arcs. Ahead, taillights glowed red through the downpour. Behind, headlights pressed close, urgent, relentless. No stopping. Not for weather. Not for exhaustion. Not for anything. In the passenger seat, Corporal Thomas Jefferson, no relation to the president, he'd tell anyone who asked, had given up trying to stay awake. His head bounced against the window frame with each pothole, a metronome of fatigue. "Jeff," Walker said, not loudly, "Jeff, stay with me." Jefferson's eyes opened halfway. "I'm here. I'm here." "Talk to me, anything. Keep me sharp." "What's there to say?" Jefferson's voice was hoarse. "We're driving. We'll keep driving. Then we'll drive some more. They say Patton's already at Nancy. 60 kilometers in 2 days. Good for Patton." Jefferson coughed. "He's riding. We're driving. Man gets to be a hero while we're just winning the war," Walker finished, 1 ton at a time. Behind them, Sergeant Willie McRae pushed his deuce-and-a-half through gears that protested every shift. The truck had been making a grinding noise since Chartres. A mechanical scream that meant something expensive was dying inside the transmission. McRae didn't care. The mechanics could fix it when he got back, if he got back. At the checkpoint outside Verdun, the white MP barely glanced at McRae's papers before waving him through. But the soldier behind the MP, a replacement private fresh from the States, stared openly at the endless line of black faces behind steering wheels. "Where are all the white drivers?" the kid asked his sergeant. The MP, older, wearier, answered without looking up. "Driving for generals who get their names in papers. These boys drive for the general who wins." McRae heard it, filed it away with 1,000 other small cuts, kept driving. By September 20th, Patton's Third Army had covered ground that military historians would spend decades analyzing. His spearheads moved faster than Napoleon's cavalry, faster than the German Blitzkrieg, faster than any mechanized force in human history. And behind every tank, every half-track, every artillery piece, stretched a supply line that never broke. At a fuel depot near Reims, Corporal David Washington leaned against his truck, smoking a cigarette in the 5 minutes they'd been given to refuel. A white lieutenant from Patton's 4th Armored Division approached, helmet tucked under his arm. "You boys saved our asses today," the lieutenant said. "We were down to fumes when your convoy showed up." Washington took a long drag. "Just doing our job, sir." "Your job is a goddamn miracle." The lieutenant extended his hand. Washington shook it, the gesture strange and formal in the mud and diesel smoke. "What keeps you going?" Washington smiled, tired, ironic. "We run on faith and diesel, sir. Sometimes we're not sure which one we've got more of." The lieutenant laughed, then stopped, realizing it wasn't entirely a joke. Somewhere ahead, Patton's tanks were already moving toward the Siegfried Line, toward Germany itself, toward a victory that seemed impossible 6 weeks earlier. And somewhere behind, in an endless convoy that stretched back to Normandy, men of iron and dust kept the wheels turning. Their hands bled, their eyes burned, their bodies screamed for rest. They drove anyway, because the road never slept. And neither could they. October 1944. The reports arrived in Tokyo like dispatches from a funeral that wouldn't end. Aachen fallen, Cologne burning, the Ruhr under bombardment. Wehrmacht divisions that once numbered 15,000 men now fielded barely 3,000. The vaunted Siegfried Line, Germany's final fortress, was being tested by American forces that showed no signs of slowing, no evidence of the logistical collapse that mathematics had promised. Colonel Hattori stood before the wall map in the Imperial War College, now covered with so many red markers indicating Allied advances that the geography itself seemed to bleed. "The Germans are finished," he said to the silent room, not because they lacked courage, not because their soldiers failed, because they could not feed their armies while America could. Major General Arisu laid another intelligence summary on the table. This one came from a Japanese technical observer who had toured American factories before the war, compiled from pre-war industrial reports and neutral country intelligence. The numbers were obscene. Ford River Rouge Plant, Michigan. 1 B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Willow Run Factory, Michigan. 1 B-24 bomber every 55 minutes. At peak production, Kaiser Shipyards, California. 1 Liberty ship every 42 days. Later, 1 ship every 24 hours. General Motors, nationwide, 206,000 trucks produced in 1943, 258,000 in 1944. "They built more trucks in 1 month," Arisue said slowly, "than our entire empire produced in 2 years. Captain Tsuji pulled out another file. "The analysis is worse. Each American factory produced more steel than our entire nation. Each of their shipyards outbuilt our combined naval yards. They constructed air bases faster than we could bomb them. Commander Nakamura added his own report from Naval Intelligence. In 1944, America launched 3.3 million tons of shipping. We launched 280,000 tons, and most of that was sunk before completion. They replaced their losses 15 times faster than we inflicted them. The room absorbed this in silence. On Hattori's desk lay photographs smuggled from neutral Switzerland. Images of American assembly lines stretching toward vanishing points. Workers in their thousands, machines stamping out weapons with the rhythm of heartbeats. Endless, industrial, unstoppable. One photograph showed the Red Ball Express from above, taken by German reconnaissance before the photographer's plane was shot down. The convoy stretched beyond the frame's edge, a river of vehicles that seemed to have no beginning and no end. They had mocked the machine. They had called American dependence on industry a weakness, a spiritual poverty, a failure of character. They had believed that discipline and sacrifice and the purity of purpose could overcome mere production. The machine had not cared about their mockery. The machine had simply continued operating, stamping, welding, assembling, shipping, driving, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, month after month. An industrial heartbeat that never skipped, never tired, never doubted itself. While Japanese pilots flew suicide missions because they lacked the fuel for return trips, American pilots complained about the coffee in their ready rooms, while German soldiers melted snow for drinking water. American GIs received daily deliveries of Coca-Cola. While Tokyo's strategists calculated the spiritual superiority of accepting death, Detroit calculated production quotas and exceeded them. "We asked the wrong question," Hattori finally said. "We asked whether men could defeat machines. We should have asked whether machines, operated by determined men, could be defeated at all." No one answered. Outside, Tokyo's factories ran on reduced schedules, starved for resources. American submarines had turned Japan's sea lanes into graveyards. The empire's logistics, once adequate for conquering nations, now struggled to feed its own people. The illusion had collapsed, not suddenly, but comprehensively. They had built their strategy on the poetry of sacrifice. America had built theirs on assembly lines. And in the arithmetic of total war, poetry could not compete with production. The machine had outlived them. The machine would outlive them all. Professor Royama Masamichi had not been invited to lecture at the Imperial War College in 3 years. His pre-war writings on industrial economics had been deemed insufficiently patriotic, too focused on material factors, not attentive enough to spiritual strength. Now, in November 1944, they summoned him back. The lecture hall held 40 officers, not the usual 200. This was not an official curriculum. It was an admission of failure disguised as continuing education. Royama stood at the podium without notes. He was 63 years old, and he no longer cared about consequences. "Gentlemen," he began, "I will tell you what you already know but have not yet spoken aloud. We lost this war before it began, not because our soldiers lacked courage, but because we fundamentally misunderstood what modern war requires." The officers shifted uncomfortably. Royama continued, "We built warriors. The Americans built workers, and their workers became warriors. That is the entire lesson of this conflict, compressed into a single sentence." He walked to the chalkboard, writing 2 numbers. Japan, 1944. Steel production, 3.9 million tons. United States, 1944. Steel production, 89.6 million tons. This is not a 20-to-1 advantage. This is the difference between waging war and waging industrial annihilation. Every ship, every tank, every truck, every shell, All of it depends on this number. And we ignored it because we believed spirit could substitute for steel. Major General Kawabe, sitting in the front row, spoke up. Professor, surely the quality of our soldiers is irrelevant when they starve. Royama's voice cut across the room like a blade. Our soldiers on Guadalcanal died of hunger, not cowardice. Our pilots fly one-way missions not from devotion, but because we lack the fuel for their return. This is not sacrifice. This is systems failure disguised as virtue. He turned back to the board, writing quickly. Germany, Japan, Ixu, same error. The Germans made identical calculations. They believed their tactical superiority, their operational brilliance, their ideological purity would overcome material disadvantage. They invaded Russia with 600,000 horses because they couldn't produce enough trucks. They called it maintaining traditional military values. The Russians called it target practice. The room remained silent. The Red Ball Express, Royama continued, is not simply a logistics operation. It is a philosophical statement about the nature of modern war. The Americans organized 23,000 drivers, most of them black men in a segregated army, and gave them a mission: make the impossible routine. They succeeded because their system valued function over hierarchy, results over purity, pragmatism over pride. He paused, letting the implications settle. We designed an empire where warriors held the highest status, where death was glorified, where spiritual strength justified material privation. We created a system optimized for heroic failure. The Americans created a system optimized for boring, repetitive success. Captain Tsuji raised his hand. Are you suggesting we were wrong to value courage and sacrifice? I am suggesting, Royama said carefully, that courage without logistics, it is suicide. Sacrifice without strategy is waste. Spirit without supply is starvation. These are not opinions. They are mathematical certainties we chose to ignore. He wrote one final phrase on the board. Hubris equals believing will can overcome reality. Germany believed their racial superiority would prevail. We believed our spiritual discipline would triumph. Both of us believed that what we wished to be true would become true through force of conviction. This is not strategy. This is prayer disguised as planning. And the Americans? An officer asked quietly. Royama smiled, bitter. The Americans believed in logistics tables, production schedules, and shipping manifests. They built supply chains the way we built shrines, with devotion, precision, and absolute faith. Their religion was efficiency. Their prayer was the assembly line. Their God was the system that never stopped working. He gathered his papers. The lecture concluded. Gentlemen, logistics is not supporting warfare. Logistics is warfare. Everything else, tactics, strategy, courage, sacrifice, all of it operates downstream from supply. We forgot this. Germany forgot this. The Americans remembered. And that, Royama said, walking toward the door, is why we are losing. The officers sat in silence long after he left. Outside, the empire continued its descent, still believing that will could overcome reality. Inside that room, men began learning the truth. Too late to matter, but not too late to understand. March 10, 1945, 12:08 a.m. Tokyo. The air raid sirens began their mechanical wail as Colonel Hattori descended into the underground command bunker beneath the Imperial War College. Above, the sky filled with the drone of B-29 superfortresses, 300 of them, carrying incendiaries that would turn 16 square miles of Tokyo into an inferno. In the bunker's dim light, the same officers who had once studied maps of France now tracked the destruction of their own city. The irony was not lost on them. The Americans, Major General Arisu said quietly, watching red markers multiply across the Tokyo grid, are now bombing us with the same logistical precision we once mocked. Each B-29 had flown 10,400 kilometers from the Marianas. Each had been fueled, armed, maintained, and crewed by a supply chain that stretched back to factories in Kansas, shipyards in California, refineries in Texas. The same industrial system that built the Red Ball Express now delivered fire from the sky with assembly line efficiency. Commander Nakamura, thinner now, his uniform hanging loose, added, "They fly 300 bombers tonight. Tomorrow, another 300. The day after, 300 more. We shoot down 20, and they replace them within a week. We lose 20 pilots, and they cannot be replaced at all." The bunker shook. Dust fell from concrete seams. Above them, Tokyo burned. Hattori opened a file he'd kept since September 1944, the original reports of the Red Ball Express, now worn at the edges from repeated reading. The numbers that once seemed impossible now seemed prophetic. 12,500 tons daily, 5,958 trucks operational, 23,000 drivers working in continuous shifts. "We laughed," he said. "Not to anyone in particular. We called it material madness, American excess, industrial waste." Captain Tsuji, still present though now skeletal from rationing, finished the thought. "And now we starve because we cannot move rice 200 kilometers from farms to cities." The truth of it sat heavy in the smoke-filled air. Japan's railways, never adequate, now lay shattered by American bombing. The trucks that might have compensated had never been built. The industrial capacity had gone to building warships that now rusted on the ocean floor. The fuel that might have powered a logistics network had been consumed by kamikaze missions that achieved nothing but theatrical death. The nation that mocked logistics now died from its absence. Another explosion, closer this time. The lights flickered. "Do you remember," Arisue asked, "what we said in September? That no army could sustain Patton's advance?" "I remember," Hattori replied. "Patton reached the Rhine in March. His army never stopped, not once." Arisue's voice was empty of emotion, just stating facts. "We calculated his collapse. We predicted his paralysis. We were certain mathematics would defeat him." "Mathematics did not account for American industry," Nakamura said, "or American will, or American organization. We confused their consumer culture for weakness. We mistook their diversity for disunity. We believed our own propaganda about spiritual superiority." The bunker shook again. Someone reported that the Asakusa district was completely engulfed. Hattori closed the file, his hands steady despite everything. Professor Royama was correct. We built warriors. They built systems. Systems do not tire. Systems do not doubt. Systems do not care about poetry or pride or the purity of sacrifice. Systems, he continued, looking at each officer in turn, simply work. Or they do not. Ours did not. Theirs did. That is the entire war, reduced to its essence. Outside, Tokyo burned with a heat that would kill 100,000 people before dawn. The firestorm created winds strong enough to uproot trees, temperatures high enough to boil water in canals. It was industrial killing, delivered with logistical precision. The same precision that had kept Patton's tanks fueled. The same precision that now starved Japan's cities while incinerating them. In the bunker, the generals who had once mocked German logistics sat in silence, breathing recycled air, listening to their capital die. They had learned the lesson the Red Ball Express taught. They had learned it perfectly. They had learned it far too late. Above them, American bombers turned for home, their fuel tanks calculated to the gallon, their return guaranteed by a supply chain that never failed. Below, in the dark, the silent realization settled into certainty. Logistics was destiny, and destiny had belonged to the side that never stopped driving. September 1952. A classroom at the newly reorganized National Defense Academy, Japan. Colonel Hattori Takushiro, now serving as a civilian instructor in the reorganized Japanese self-defense forces, stood before a class of young officers who had been children during the war. On the screen behind him, American newsreel footage flickered. The interstate highway system, still under construction, stretching across the continental United States like steel arteries. President Eisenhower, Hattori explained, designed this highway network based on what he learned commanding Allied logistics in Europe. He saw the Red Ball Express and understood something we did not, that the infrastructure of war and the infrastructure of peace are identical. The students took notes. They had no memory of the empire's hubris, no attachment to its illusions. They were learning logistics as engineers, not warriors as poets. On the screen, American trucks, descendants of the Deuce and a Half, rolled along pristine highways. The footage cut to German autobahns being rebuilt under Marshall Plan funding, then to Japanese ports being reconstructed with American assistance. The United States, Hattori continued, spent more money rebuilding its enemies than it spent defeating them. This is not generosity. This is logistics extended into peacetime. They understood that stability requires supply chains, that prosperity requires transportation, that peace requires the same systematic thinking that war demands. He advanced to the next slide, a photograph from 1944, grainy and worn, showing the Red Ball Express in full operation. Endless trucks, headlights blazing, stretching to the horizon. 23,000 drivers, Hattori said quietly, most of them black men serving a nation that denied them basic civil rights. They were not allowed to eat in white restaurants, yet they fed white generals' armies. They could not vote in many states, yet they delivered victory for democracy. He paused, letting the paradox settle. What does this teach us? That systems can succeed even when societies fail. That logistics can function even when justice does not. That efficiency and morality are separate calculations, though history suggests they converge eventually. A student raised his hand. Sir, if the Americans were hypocrites about race, how did they defeat us? Hattori smiled, sad and knowing. Because hypocrisy is survivable. Hubris is not. They built systems larger than their prejudices. We built prejudices larger than our systems. The newsreel continued. Footage now of Patton'S tanks rolling through Germany, supplied by trucks that never stopped. Then footage of Tokyo in ruins, starving because trucks never existed. The final lesson, Hattori said, is the simplest and the hardest. Spirit alone can start a war. Only logistics can end one. He switched off the projector. The room fell into darkness except for the light from the windows, where outside American-designed trucks carried goods through a Japan being rebuilt by the same industrial logic that had defeated it. We believed in Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit. The Germans believed in their racial destiny. Both of us believed that will could overcome material reality. Hattori's voice carried across the silent classroom. We were not defeated by American soldiers. We were defeated by American supply clerks, truck drivers, factory workers, and logistics officers whose names no one remembers. He gathered his papers. In 1944, I stood in this city and calculated that Patton would collapse from lack of supply. I was certain. The mathematics were perfect. What I failed to calculate was American determination to make the mathematics irrelevant through sheer industrial will. Outside, a truck horn sounded, a civilian vehicle carrying goods in a peaceful nation, following roads designed by men who had learned logistics from war. The hum you hear, Hattori said, is not just trucks. It is history's engine, the sound of civilization itself. Supply, demand, transportation, delivery. The Red Ball Express proved that this hum is more powerful than any battle cry, Any ideology, any spirit. He walked to the door, then turned back. Learn this well. Wars are fought with courage, but they are won with clipboards, manifests, fuel depots, and tire gauges. They are won by men who never fire a shot, but never stop driving. The class dismissed. The students filed out into a Japan being rebuilt by the same logistics that had destroyed it. In the distance, the hum continued. Trucks rolling, goods moving, systems functioning. The eternal sound of supply meeting demand. The sound of peace built on the lessons of war. The sound that never stops. Spirit alone can start a war. Only logistics can end one.